Hello and welcome to the Australian Cannabis Review. I'm your host Dan, and we're talking about cannabis news from around Australia and the world. So, this being the introductory podcast, thanks for listening, everyone. If you've got any questions or details, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me at the Australian Cannabis Review at gmail.com. So, what we aim to provide is pretty much a comprehensive view of what's going on in the world of cannabis or marijuana. These terms will be used interchangeably in the podcast. We'll have guests coming on the show as well, but for today, this is our first show, and it's going to be a solo ride with me. So, hope you can sit back wherever you're listening to this on your drive before you knock off to sleep, which might be adequate because the cadence of my voice, I've been told, might make you feel that way. Okay, well, let's begin. So I'm going to start off every podcast with news from around the world. So what's been happening in that space, and then we'll return to what's happened in Australia. Now, we're just under 2 weeks away from Canada legalizing cannabis for recreational purposes. This is a huge step. It's only one of the few countries around the world which is legalizing it for the recreational purpose. So pretty much everyone in the country, they can go out and buy a stick of bud for their own personal enjoyment, just like they would a beer. So back in July, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, announced that bill had passed through the Parliament. So that's really great news for them. And I'm sure I'll be covering that as gets closer to the date. And in conjunction with that, what's actually been some really crazy news is that the cannabis stocks in America have been going crazy. One of the major stories for the month is a company called Tilray. Now, they're from a small town called Nanaimo, which is located on Vancouver Island. And Tilray is listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And they only listed about 2 months ago at $17 per share. Now, about a week and a bit ago, their share price surged massively to $300 per share, before retracing back to about $100 pretty quickly. And then it's jumped back now to about $160 at time of recording. They've had some new announcements made, so it's kind of propped their share price back up. So even at this point in time, their share price has gone up 1,000%, going up nearly about 800%, where that peak was of $300 a share. Now that's pretty crazy, and I think I've got to give a public service announcement as well before we do go any further, because if I am going to be talking about the stock market here in Australia and abroad, I have to let everyone know that what's being said here is just for entertainment and educational purposes. I don't want anybody to taking advice they should buy these stocks, because what I've just mentioned before, for those who know about trading shares, a lot of new industries, they're quite volatile. They are the realm of day traders and speculators, which pretty much means that the share price is going to be pretty volatile. So a share price going up of north of about 1,800% in a few months, that's just crazy. Then over the next course of a week, it's gone down about 66%, and then it's gone back up around 56% the week after that. So to put that into some kind of perspective, if you had a $10,000 investment in that stock, you would then have 2 months later, when it peaked at the $300 a share price, you would now have $180,000. Then after it dropped, that 66% back down to $100, you've only multiplied your profit by about 7 times to be exact. So you're back down to $70,000, and then it's gone back up to $160 a share. So you're back to nearly $100,000. So that would be fantastic news if you had bought the share at $17 per share and seeing, those kinds of rises. Then you could maybe deal with that fluctuation, because you've still made, even to this point in time, a fairly decent profit. But say if you bought at the top of that mark, then you would have bought at $300 a share, and that share now is worth $160 a share. So that kind of volatility is really not what's wanted. But also, having said that, I mean, this is a new industry around the world and in Australia. And currently in Australia, there are probably about 20 odd medicinal cannabis stocks, or stocks that, are kind of in one way or another involved with dealing with cannabis or hemp or medicinal cannabis. And, some of them are based in Australia, some of them have got their offices, abroad, some focusing on Europe, some in North America. So we've really got a mixed bag of ganja on our hands. And I'll go into further detail about some of these stocks in our future podcasts. Because I really believe that some of these stocks could give good returns over the next 5 to 10 years, especially if the Australian industry goes in the way that the industry in the US and Canada has gone. And you might, make a lot of money on it, but it is also quite, like I said before, a speculative industry. And, you kind of want to make sure you do your due diligence, or you don't put all your eggs in the one basket, so that, if that investment doesn't turn out okay, you've got, something else to go on to. Because, Tilray, what's happened with them is also that they've only made about $20 million in revenue, right? And when they peaked, just a few weeks ago, their market cap was more than a company, for example, called Barrick Gold Group. And they're the largest gold company in the world. Now, a company dealing with gold, that's a bit more stable. And that company, they had $8 billion in revenue as compared to $20 million from what I just mentioned with Tilray. So you can kind of see the comparison there, 20 million to 8 billion. Most of the price is based around the future hype. And yeah, like I said, I'll go into a bit more detail into the stock stuff a bit later on. But for now, we'll move forward, because I'm sure, not everyone wants to hear me talking about stocks, as this is a cannabis podcast, even though that'll be a small part of what goes on here. So, Elon Musk, he smoked a doobie on the Joe Rogan podcast. Now, a lot of people gave him a bit of shit for it, and it was kind of reflected in the stock market, where their share price kind of went down a bit. But I think it was just way too much hype. I don't think he even properly inhaled. Elon Musk, he's a really smart guy. I think at least he's got a lot of brilliant ideas. You think what you want about the man. He is a bit of an eccentric, but he is an ideas man, that's for sure. And I would highly recommend anyone that wants to listen to that podcast, go to the Joe Rogan Experience podcast and have a download. It's quite interesting. Moving on, Coca-Cola also announced that they're closely watching the development of cannabis drinks. This is another space that's been quite popular, and even though Coca-Cola says that they're not really interested in, investing in cannabis, they are interested in the space where they can make a beverage out of it. So they're looking at, getting the other chemical compounds found in cannabis, so not the THC, but the CBD, which is used to help people with, various conditions. So you might hear that people, young people use it for epilepsy and their seizures. People use it for, as an anti-inflammatory, for pain, for nausea, migraines, depression, anxiety, these kinds of things. So it's really got those health benefits from the CBD, and that's kind of what they're looking for in making a drink out of that. A bit closer to home, Malaysia is mulling over about legalizing medicinal cannabis, no pun intended on the mulling. They are thinking about it. The country does have really tight drug restrictions, so who knows how that will go in the future. But that is one place to watch, as more and more countries around the world are legalizing medicinal cannabis. I guess it's the first step forward, I believe. If we look back, in the early 2000s, Canada legalized cannabis for medicinal purposes. I believe it was in July 2001. So Australia made that move in 2016. So if you can kind of make a comparison, we're about a decade and a half off the mark on that one. And in California, in the USA, medicinal cannabis was legalized in 1996. Now, over time, we've got many countries in South America, many countries in Europe legalized it for medicinal purposes. So, naturally, I think this is the way to go, where countries will legalize cannabis for medicinal purposes. As time goes on, they'll make it easier for access for patients, as it was, quite difficult in the beginning. In Australia, there's been a lot of issues with access to medicinal cannabis. For patients, it's still much easier and cheaper for them to get on the black market. At least that's what I've read from the various papers and information that I've heard around. So I think as time goes on, governments, as they naturally are, they're slow to move on some of these issues. So they will gradually move forward as more information comes out about the health benefits of cannabis, as it kind of becomes more normalized. Over time, I believe that these regulations will become looser, access will be easier, the social stigma will, ease, and people won't think it's such a bad, substance, as, many people probably don't. If you're listening to this podcast, I assume, you're probably abreast with some of these issues, but if you're not, there's facts and figures such as 1 in 6 Australians has smoked cannabis at one point in their life. So even though I guess those people that have taken marijuana are in the minority still, it's a substance that many people have tried, and if it was legal, who knows, maybe some more people would have tried it. I mean, a lot of people have tried alcohol, that's legal. From the information that I read, more people are hospitalized for alcohol and tobacco issues rather than for cannabis. But who knows, I mean, it's hard to say right now. But as we'll go on with time, this is probably the natural course, and Australia will, eventually step up to the world. And there is a lot of money to be made from tax excises. So I believe that's where the government will kind of look towards making their decision in the future. But we will just have to watch this space. Now, that's just wrapping up the news for this podcast. It's going to be pretty brief this time. But before I head into our main story, which is about the latest report that's come out from the Senate committee regarding Senator Leyonhjelm's bill on legalizing cannabis for recreational purposes, because I kind of want to talk about it a little bit, as I kind of felt it didn't really get enough attention in the media. If it did get any attention, it was glossed over a little bit. So before I go on to that, there is another segment I want to go through just really quickly, which is the ASX market update. So for those that don't know, the ASX is the Australian Stock Exchange, and every week I'm going to just go over what's been the big news on the Australian Stock Exchange related to the Australian medicinal cannabis sector stocks. Now, as is the first podcast, I'm just going to talk about what's happened in September. So a brief overview is that there is a new medicinal cannabis company which has listed on the ASX on the 21st of September, and they're called Althea Group Holdings. Now, they did an IPO, which is an initial public offering, for about $19.65 million at about 20 cents per share. Now, the offering was only offered to institutional investors, so it means regular investors like myself, and maybe many of the people listening weren't actually privy to that offering. When the shares listed on the stock exchange on the 21st of September, their price just jumped up from 20 cents, should I say, to 56 cents per share at the close of trade. So those investors made a nice handy 180% profit in one day. Now, I think the share price will probably stay at around the 50 cent mark or continue to go higher as they get more licenses. They've also got a backing by a company called Althea. They have a 25% stake in the company, And they are also rated up there as being some of the top cannabis companies in the world. And at current, they've got about a market capitalization of around 4.2 billion Canadian dollars. So they're definitely one of the bigger players in the game. And on a personal note, I think if they've got a bigger backing from a Canadian company, this is kind of one of those stocks that you might kind of want to keep out onto. Now, as a market as a whole, what's happened over the last few months, I would say, just kind of give or take, is the best performing stock out there has been a company called Elixinol Global. Now, they're kind of based in the hemp foods industry, so they're not actually dealing with medicinal cannabis, they're more dealing with hemp-based foods and products. Their share price over the month, or even 2 months, has gone up about 40%. And they also did a capital raising of around $40 million the other week as well. So this company, they're actually getting some sales, unlike some other companies out there. So this is a second stock just to have a look at. Overall, though, if you looked at the market, it had lost about 5.6%. So what I mean by that is that all the shares that are in the medicinal cannabis space, they've gone down by 5.6% as a whole. However, most of that has been related to a drop in some of the smaller companies, which really, they're only just dipping their toes in the market and their share price is quite volatile. So I guess it's not a true reflection of what's actually going on, because most of these shares do get a spike when there is some significant news regarding the change to cannabis legislation. So, segueing to what I really wanted to talk about today is about what Senator Leyonhjelm was going on about. So, on the 10th of May in 2018, the Senate referred what they call the provisions of the Criminal Code and other legislation amendment. So it's removing Commonwealth restrictions on cannabis, and that bill they put to the Legal and Constitutional Legislation Assembly for inquiry and report by August 2018. Now, the Senate Selection of Bills Committee recommended that the bill be referred to the inquiry for the following reasons: that this is actually in Australia the first legislation to propose the removal of Commonwealth restrictions on cannabis. So they thought that there was a case to examine where they looked at the merits of the legislation, the law enforcement issues, extradition issues, issues based on the Constitution, treaty issues, trade issue rules, Commonwealth state issues, as well as budgetary issues. So there's kind of a lot mentioned in this report, and from the articles that I found online and in the media, there wasn't really much going on. So just to give some background, so the bill is a private member's bill introduced into the Senate by Senator David Leyonhjelm. So he's a Queensland senator, he's a Liberal, he's got some interesting ideas, some things I'm for, some things I'm against. He has said some pretty outrageous things in the past, but this is one thing that I really support. So in his reading of the speech in Parliament, he stated that the principle of the bill should be that adults should be free to make their own decisions, right, as long as they don't harm others. And accordingly, this bill, which they plan to introduce, removes offences and civil provisions in Commonwealth law for dealing with cannabis. They also focused on the fact that the prohibition of cannabis casts otherwise law-abiding citizens as criminals. It increases pressure on the criminal justice system and props up organised and violent crime. So I totally agree with those statements. And further, he goes on to mention that legalising cannabis is estimated to reduce annual Commonwealth law enforcement expenditure by around $100 million and increase annual GST revenue by around $300 million. Furthermore, he goes on to say that cannabis use is less harmful than alcohol use and cannabis use. I totally agree with that. Now, there are some statements that are put forth in the recommendations of this bill. There were actually recommendations against that, even though, like I'd mentioned before, how governments might look at the dollar figure to legalize cannabis for recreational purposes. We're looking at about $100 million drop in the law enforcement expenditure and an increase of around $300 million in GST revenues. Now, these are all numbers that have been pulled out from somewhere. There has been speculation that these numbers have just been pulled out of a hat, and there isn't too much conclusive evidence based around them. And also, there is also some talk about what could happen in the space of, the health sector. So there are going to be increases in the health sector with, people using cannabis adversely, young people using it. That could be potential. I mean, these are these are issues that I just don't think are kind of right, because they've brought these issues on saying, young people use it and they'll abuse it. Well, young people can also abuse tobacco and alcohol and get access to that as well, and that's legal. So I think some of the arguments are a bit, I would probably say, weak in this respect, and we should look a bit further into the issues, though. I totally agree with, what could happen in the health sector. I mean, this is a psychoactive drug, so it can affect people's, states of consciousness. It does. And some people probably shouldn't be smoking cannabis, just like some people shouldn't be drinking alcohol. Now, taking some facts from the National Drug Strategy, they said that in 2016, about 10.4% of Australians over the age of 14 have used cannabis in the last 12 months, and 34.8% of Australians had used cannabis in their lifetime. So I think I mentioned the stat of about 14% earlier in the podcast. According to this survey from the National Drug Strategy, it's just over about a third of people have used this drug. And the other thing I don't like about this terminology is a drug. Some people call it a medicine. So I prefer the use of medicine. What I really like that's mentioned in the bill is that what the supporters raised and what they thought the pro issues were. So they said that it enhances the civil rights of Australians by allowing greater personal use for cannabis users, okay? Because in the current situation, there's a disproportion between, what they consider are the minor health harms of cannabis use on the one hand, with the significant costs of criminalising cannabis users and the cost of prohibition and law enforcement on the other. So is there a payoff between having this drug illegal and then we're giving people criminal records, and in some ways, affecting the course of their lives and their careers? And is that a suitable enough payoff to legalise cannabis where we don't have to worry about that issue, right? And from a personal choice and civil rights issue, I mean, adults should be free to make their own choices as long as they don't harm other people. Now, I kind of wish I had a guest on this podcast right now going against the issue, so I'll say it myself. I don't think it should be a blanket fact that just because your personal use doesn't harm anybody, doesn't affect anybody at all, then you should be able to do what you want to do. Because say somebody's under the influence of the drug while driving, or they develop a habit that's bad that then affects their family members. All plausible situations, but currently I guess we could just look at the same comparison for alcohol, where why should we have alcohol legal? Because people should have the free right to do it, but on the other hand, it with alcoholism, it affects families' lives, and people's lives get ruined by it, and drunk drivers crash their cars into other people and innocently kill people. So that happens as well, but there's no up-in-arms fight to ban alcohol, I don't see. And in the bill, an organisation called 360 Edge, so they actually made a submission that cannabis use should be a matter of personal choice. They argued that since cannabis only has minor health harms, its use should not be subject to Commonwealth oversight. So I totally agree with what they're having to say with that. I mean, with cannabis, there is relatively speaking, there is a low level or low rate of dependence, and there's a very low likelihood of overdosing on cannabis. I mean, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to overdose on cannabis. I've heard some crazy numbers that you got to consume like so many hundreds of kilograms in the space of half an hour to overdose. So I don't think it's physically possible. Other submissions mentioned in the bill here is that Dr. Alex Wodak, a physician with over 40 years of clinical experience, submitted that the harms from cannabis are dwarfed by the legal drugs, alcohol, and tobacco. Another name that was withheld, who uses cannabis, echoed his view and said that in his experience, whatever problems cannabis may cause, they pale in significance when compared to the issues that prohibition has brought us. Many others suffer the same as myself, and because of the demonization and misunderstanding in the community, we are second-class citizens who are treated like lepers and are too afraid to stand up for what is right because of the draconian and heavy-handed law. Wow. I mean, these are some of the comments that I've heard from medicinal cannabis users as well. And they are treated like that, and this is what is a daily occurrence, and they have to go look at the black market to access the drug. So it's definitely a true issue, and this is just one example, testimonial that's included in here. Furthermore, I'll go on that Emeritus Professor Ian W. Webster, AO, a physician providing primary health care, supported the bill, and he submitted that current criminal sanctions mean, number one, that already impaired persons are being further disadvantaged by the risk of being criminalized when they use cannabis to manage their life problems, and secondly, that in an attempt to treat the complex medical problems of patients using cannabis and other substances, primary health providers, so general practitioners, are at risk of jeopardizing their professional standing. So this goes on that it's, even though there is a pathway for doctors to subscribe medicinal cannabis, it's seen as a substance that really can't be, used as often as some other substances or medicines, which they call, which can be used to treat drugs. And thirdly, I'd like to just mention the FFDLR. Now, they argued that the traditional view of cannabis as a gateway drug for more serious substances has been disproven, and the illegal status of the drug did not act as a deterrent for its use. Quote, "One can say with confidence, though, that the illicit status of cannabis does little, if anything, dissuade young people from trying it. It is frequently said that cannabis is a gateway drug to other more dangerous ones. This idea is commonly bandied around by those who defend criminal prohibition. Cannabis often does come before use of harder drugs like methamphetamine and heroin, but so does alcohol and tobacco. The link is not pharmacological, but sociological and physiological. And if that statement were true, then it would be tobacco and alcohol, which would be the gateway drug." Other organizations that submitted recommendations to the bill include the Alcohol and Drug Foundation. Now, even though they did not support the bill, they nevertheless mentioned that there is a need for drug law reform, especially as current penalties, in its view, aren't really appropriate. And I quote, "People charged with low-level cannabis offences or possession and or use of cannabis face consequences that are not proportionate to the offence. These include impeding access to certain occupations and travel to certain countries. An advantage of removing criminal sanctions for low-level cannabis offences would be the avoidance of a criminal record, reduced stigma leading to better access to treatment, and the relieving of a burden on the law enforcement and judicial systems. Advocates for drug law reform usually propose either the degree of criminalization or the legislation of cannabis," end quote. So there you go again. The Alcohol and Drug Foundation, even though not supporters of the bill, are in favour of changing the current penalties, as they believe that they are disproportionate. Furthermore, I have to mention that from 360 Edge, the organisation, they mentioned that from their economic analysis of the impact of cannabis legislation, they calculate the net social benefit of that legislation at $727.5 million per year. And this is significantly higher than what we currently have, where they get around $295 million from generating revenue from fines. Now, looking into some of the opposition to the bill, the Department of Health set out the current Commonwealth position on the health harms of cannabis in its submission, and they emphasised the burden that cannabis can have on the healthcare system. And I quote, while many Australians may view cannabis use as harmless, almost a quarter of Australia's drug and alcohol treatment services are being provided to people identifying cannabis as their principal drug of concern. Brackets, roughly the same number of treatments episode as for amphetamine use. Close bracket. Cannabis use has been demonstrated to have significant negative health outcomes, including problems with memory and learning, addiction, decreased motivation and concentration, anxiety, increased risk of respiratory diseases, paranoia, and in some cases, psychosis. End quote. Now, I agree with a number of those things that have been mentioned there. That's why I believe that if we take the proper steps in regulating the access to this drug, we have the right education processes set in place, then I think we could, definitely make much better decisions. Some submitters and witnesses argued that also the drug is inevitably harmed not only the substance user, but also the users around them. It's kind of what I mentioned a bit before, and this is the example from Drug Free Australia, where they stated, quote, "The notion that illicit drug use is a victimless crime and that everyone should be free to do what they want with their body disregards the web of social interactions that constitute human existence. Affected by an individual's illicit drug use are children, parents, grandparents, friends, colleagues, work, victims of drug drivers, crime victims, elder abuse, sexual victims, patients made sicker by medicinal marijuana. Illicit drug use is no less victimless than alcoholism." Wow. Okay. I mean, first time I've ever heard the quote here, sexual victims made to the use of marijuana. But okay. I mean, some of the issues are definitely in place where, people can be affected by it, but I think everything in moderation. So there were a number of submissions to this bill. They also talked about, will Australia be adhering to the UN's Convention on narcotic drugs? So the International Narcotics Control Board, they've got kind of documents, legislation set in place where kind of the countries of the world have to adhere to, and Australia maybe could have an impact on that if they did legalise recreational cannabis. Now, the committee did come to a decision, and before I go on to tell you what that decision is, if you've been holding your breath and eagerly waiting, firstly, the committee understands that there are passionate advocates on both sides of the debate on Australia's approach to cannabis, with some advocating for full legislation of cannabis use, while others are calling for tighter prohibition and more stringent law enforcement. Noting this diversity of opinion, it is clear to the committee that the removal of all Commonwealth prohibitions on cannabis, as proposed by the bill, would have serious consequence in several areas. Cannabis clearly presents serious physical and mental health risks to casual users. Although this committee recognises the importance and value of Australia's medicinal cannabis regime, the risks of the health of casual and regular recreational users cannot be easily ignored when considering a legislative change to make cannabis a more widely available legal substance. The committee is particularly concerned about any increased availability of cannabis to young and vulnerable Australians. Moreover, evidence showed that the use of cannabis can present direct health risks not only to users but also those around them. This includes recognised health dangers to cannabis users' families and children, as well as risks for the broader community, most seriously from drug driving and work health and safety issues. Yes, just like we have issues with drink driving. The removal of all Commonwealth prohibitions on cannabis will also compromise our recently established system that provides medicinal cannabis to Australians suffering from chronic conditions. While the committee acknowledges that this system could be improved, as is clear from evidence, it is also clear that removing Commonwealth oversight to the medicinal system while legislating all forms of cannabis is not the answer. Wow. Can't believe they've actually said that. In regards to Commonwealth oversight and control of both medical and illicit cannabis, the committee considers that the harm minimisation approach to cannabis, as contained in the National Drug Strategy, currently strikes a good balance and so should be maintained. So, in conclusion, the committee agrees with many of the submitters that argued this bill is flawed and premature, and considers that the known risks of illegal cannabis use greatly outweighs the potential benefits of legislation as contained in this bill. End result, the recommendation is the committee recommends that the Senate not pass the bill. From the Senator, the Honourable Ian MacDonald, who was the chair. Now, that's pretty heartbreaking, I guess, if you were really for this bill. I think some of the reasons for are quite weak in some ways. There is a lot of medicinal benefits. I mean, Australia used to be a world leader in a number of things. Sadly, again, we just go with the status quo. The old white men sitting in their high chairs. And, yeah, they would much prefer, for people to not take substance that is grown in nature, rather go to your doctor and buy some medicines. I don't know, I'm quite disappointed with that decision. Initially in the report, there were some really, really good decisions for, as I've outlined. Some of the decisions against, I kind of agreed with. But all in all, when you look at other substances that are legal, it's really no worse. So, I guess we're coming to the end of our first podcast. Thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you listen to it again. I'll be back next week for the second edition. If you got any questions or you want me to talk about anything specific, please get in touch at AustralianCannabisReview@gmail.com. I've been Dan. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.